Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here today, for your dedicated service as directors, and also for your interest as owners in associations and as employees. Thank you to Milton for inviting me this morning, and for his, as you heard, decades of dedicated service to this industry. You are an exceptional group of people to be here today on a nice Saturday morning learning about issues that are maybe not of interest to a lot of other people. But the topics that we're going to talk about today have, major significance to condo associations, and I know that you're here because of some need for information. My topic, as Milton said, is contracts, and I'm going to focus the discussion on renovation contracts, but I wanted to get a sense of where you are on these types of projects. How many of you are members of an association that has had a renovation project of more than $2 million in the last 5 years? Okay, a few. How many of you are in associations that are looking to do renovation projects in excess of $2 million in the next 5 years? A few. Okay. 2 million or more, but okay. When I started doing this kind of work a couple of decades ago, it was unusual to find a job that was more than $500,000. That was kind of a high price for a renovation project, and now it's really not common, even for smaller projects, to have projects over $1 million or more than $2 million, because some of the big ticket items are really reaching their end of life, like windows, pipes, spalling, projects of that type that are extremely expensive. So I hope that the information that I provide will help you to get a successful result, and also to avoid litigation with owners, and also litigation over defects in the work that is performed. And so what I want to talk about in the 30 minutes is basically 4 areas. I want to talk about, first, what will be repaired. And what I mean by that is, what is the item to be repaired? Is it a common element, limited common element, or part of the apartment? And I'll explain why that's so significant. Second, who must approve the work? Because depending upon the renovation work that you're going to be doing, you may have to get owner approval for different aspects, and you may have to get a higher approval requirement for some portions of the project. Third, who pays for the work? Is this work that you can charge back to individual owners, or is it going to be paid by the association as a common expense? And fourthly, if it's the association's responsibility to pay for it, how are you going to pay for this major renovation? This is not a self-help seminar or presentation. In fact, to the contrary, what I want to express to you is that there is a need, and there are resources available to help you avoid problems on your contracts, and that includes legal help, engineering, project management, all sorts of resources to keep your project on track. And, even for a small contract, I would recommend that every association have their attorney review it. And if it's a very small contract, there's nothing wrong with a director or a president or property manager calling the attorney and saying, this is a small contract, can you just take a look at it in an hour or two and give us some comments, just to make sure that there aren't major problems. one of my rules of thumb is the smaller the font size, the bigger people should be worried about their contracts. And I'm just shocked that contractors, put in their contracts like 8-point font that you could really never see, and that always raises concerns. So anyway, my presentation starts, I think it's on page 5 of your handout, and hopefully you can see with the lighting in here, but there's a picture. Yours is black and white, but there's a picture of, I think it's the U.S. Supreme Court. It says renovations governing documents and contracts. And since we don't have PowerPoint, I'm going to refer to the pages as we go through this discussion. So the first page is the next page that doesn't have a page number, but it's page 1. It starts with repairs, replacements, alterations, and additions. So the first question that you have to ask yourself, or if you're a member, you have to make sure your board asks, is this component one of 3 categories? So we start out simple with condominiums. You either have a common element, you have a limited common element, or you have an apartment. But then it gets complicated from there, like a lot of things. The common elements are basically the portions of the project that everybody owns jointly in common. And usually it's the association, in almost every case, that has to maintain those components. The second part are limited common elements, which are still common elements, but they're a special category of common elements, and so owners, one or less than all of the owners, it can be 2, it can be 50% of the owners in the project, but they have an exclusive easement to use these portions of the common elements. So we call those limited common elements. The statute does, actually. And the last category are the portions of the project that individual owners own, and we call that apartments. So a common problem in condominiums is that the documents don't specifically identify every item in your project as a common element or part of the apartments. The documents, when they're drafted by the attorney who's assisting the developer, may not have all of the information or whatever, for whatever reason. It's not unusual to find documents that are not crystal clear on whether something is part of the apartment or the common element, and frequently windows and doors are in that category. And it can really run the gamut between, being part of doors can be part of the apartment, or the finished interior portion can be part of the apartment, and the rest of the doors are common elements, or the door could be in the apartment and just the finished exterior side is a common element. It's kind of a myriad of possibilities, and so you need to look at everything carefully, because this is kind of like setting off a missile. You need to start with the right trajectory on all of these issues, because getting it corrected a year down the road or after the project is completed is just too late, and it's going to lead to expenses, litigation, all kinds of problems. So the first issue is, what is this component? And I put on page 1 a quote from a document that was actually part of a litigated case that was litigated for many years. The whole case, from arbitration to circuit court proceedings to the appeal, ran for about 5 years. And you know what the issue was? The issue was mainly whether a door was a common element. And you can just imagine how much legal fees were spent litigating this issue. And I gave you a quote, and I won't read it, but I just ask you to read it when you go home, or have a cup of coffee, and ask yourself this: based on this excerpt on page 1, do you think it's clear that the doors are common elements, apartments, portions of the apartments, or other? Now, the board in that case said the doors are not part of the apartments, they're common elements. The circuit court ruled that the doors are part of the apartment, and the Intermediate Court of Appeals on appeal said it's ambiguous. It could go either way. And so that it is kind of astounding on one hand, but on the other hand, we have seen documents that are not clear. I think the message is that the appellate courts are very quick to find ambiguities in documents, and when there's an ambiguity, can you guess what happens? It goes back to the trial court for trial over whether a door is a common element or part of an apartment. So one thing that can be done in most cases, I think, is if you carefully review the documents, you find an ambiguity, you can, in most cases, do an amendment to correct it. It probably will take about a few months to draft it, send it to owners, get owners to approve it, and record it. And that can go a long way to avoid these kinds of costly disputes. And oftentimes the dispute is not over something of real material significance to people, but as Kainani is going to talk about, there are disputes that arise over any number of issues and associations, and sometimes people will latch on to whatever they can to express their emotions, and so litigation is one way. So why is this important? It's important because whether it's a common element, apartment, or limited common element determines, and now I'm on page 2, significance of categories. It determines whether maintenance, repairs, and replacements can be performed at common expense or at the apartment owner's expense. And I know that a lot of boards are very concerned about maintenance assessments, and sometimes boards prefer to pass on expenses to apartment owners when they can. And so this is one area that would help you to do that if it is part of the apartment, or sometimes limited common element expenses are to be borne by apartment owners, so associations can pass those kinds of expenses on. Secondly, it determines who must maintain, replace, and repair these elements. Sometimes documents are surprising. I have one project where a concrete lanai that juts out of every apartment in a tower is actually a limited common element that each owner must maintain and repair. And so provisions like that can be very problematic. Third, determines whether the board can borrow funds for maintenance, replacement, and repair, and I'll talk about that briefly later. It affects approval requirements for alterations and additions, because generally, if it's a common element, you're going to have a higher approval requirement than if it's just a portion of the apartment. And lastly, it determines who must insure the project, and Sue will talk about insurance later. So how to determine whether something's part of an apartment, common elements, limited common elements? You have to look at your documents. You have to look at your declaration and bylaws, and you have to look at it from the beginning to the end, because there may be provisions there that have some bearing on this. And then after you review the declaration and bylaws, you need to look at the statute. And I put in here in the table in the middle of page 2, HRS section 514B35 states in part, except as provided in the declaration, and all of these definitions apply. So there are different categories: unit, that means apartment, common element, and limited common element. And it states what constitutes part of those various components. The thing to keep in mind is that Chapter 5 514B, which is the Condominium Property Act, is not a very easy document to read, in part because some of it is retroactive, some of it is not retroactive, some of it overrides your documents, some of it is subservient to your documents. In other words, if your documents say a door is a common element and the statute says something differently, your declaration would control. But sometimes the statute says this overrides what's in your document, so the statute controls over that. And then sometimes it's kind of maybe less clear as to which one overrides the other. But unless your documents say specifically that something falls within the three categories, you can look to the statute, and that may help you. So that's the first question, what is it? The second question is, who must approve the work? And again, the first place to look is your documents, because that's going to substantially control what approval requirements there are. And that will vary from project to project. But you also have to look at 514B, Section 140. And there, now we're on page 3, there are several categories of different kinds of work. And this comes straight from the statute, but I organized it in a way that makes it a little easier to understand. So generally, there's a category of work that owners cannot do, and that's basically work that's going to jeopardize the structure or create major problems in the project. So that kind of work inside the apartment is prohibited. The second part of the types of alterations that can be done are material additions or alterations. So these are provisions that will not cause the structure to be unsound, but they are in an area that the legislature feels needs to be closely scrutinized. And so in those cases, owners need to get not only board approval, but they need to get the approval of 67% of the owners in the project to do. And an example of that might be